it would be very appropriate to congratulate William on his curatorial success and to honour James, who I can't see now.
On your left.
On my left, honour James, for his nobility in putting this show on and making it possible to study the Toby and the Grey organisation action in the way that we can here. So the subject this evening is direct action versus online activism. It's a subject we might deal with very quickly. There are all sorts of other interesting things to talk about. The things that I'm interested in are the art itself and other things, music at the time, masculinity. There seems to be it could be interesting to explore ideas of masculinity, but we do have to honour the subject. So direct action versus online activism. I used to like the concept of a draw in football. They don't have draws in football anymore. It's they're penalty shootouts. But I like the humility of the draw required of the spectators. They will go home and reflect. We don't have that now. But in terms of this being a choice, I'd be happy with a draw. What about you, Stewart?
Exactly the same. I think the two things should be integrated, and you see that with possibly the best known direct action around London at the moment, Extinction Rebellion. They do all their stuff on Twitter or Facebook if you want to follow them, and they do their actions in the street, and the two combined are the most effective, bring the most effective result.
Toby, have you got a yes or no?
Well, I'm more in favour of direct action because they become kind of significant events, like pulling down statues, throwing grey paint around, and you can have Twitter campaigns and Instagram and mobilise people for a demonstration, but I think nothing rivals an actual action by those, brave enough to put themselves out there.
I was quite comfortable with my understanding of this until I made the mistake of researching it a bit and thinking. And online activism includes things like trolling, hoaxing, hacking, denial of service attacks, Zoom bombing. So people are sitting at home doing this, but it does feel very much like an action and hugely successful. Trolls must be the most successful militant wing for change, i.e. making the world a more horrible place than ever existed. What about your action in 1985? Do you look at it now and take a different view on it now?
No, because it stands up. But obviously there was no online activism, so maybe there was letter writing or something. But
newspapers, legal attending, etc.
Yeah.
Meetings.
Yeah, but this, I don't know, maybe it was something like that situationist thing, like create something, like a spectacular. Not that we were well versed in that kind of language, it was more a kind of instinctive thing for us at the time. But obviously, unlike doing a sort of well thought out online campaign, they're not memorable. I can't think of any. Whereas this, now 37 years later, is still memorable. And others who did other things, like, I think Malcolm McLaren once went into Selfridges at Christmas time.
No, it wasn't Malcolm McLaren.
Who was
He
it?
claimed it, but when if you, because my mother was friends with Charlie Radcliffe, well,
Right.
drug dealing, she wasn't into the politics, and Chris Gray, so I spent a lot of time with both of them towards the end of their lives, and it wasn't Malcolm McLaren.
But tell them the story.
Well, originally it was done in Macy's in New York, so it was a very interesting group called Black Mask, who then morphed into another group called Up Against the Wall Motherfucker, led by a guy called Ben Morea, and who worked interestingly with Aldo Tambolini, so there's a whole interesting art world connection and does very interesting abstract painting. But they decided to kind of treat the kids to the spectacle of Santa Claus being arrested by the cops by dressing up as Santa Claus and going into Macy's and handing out free toys. And then this was copied by King Mob in London, because you can kind of reuse activist techniques in different places, and you know, that's why it's useful to have some grasp of that history, and you can redeploy the same tactics in other places. I mean, I've done the same thing. For example, there was the famous hippie levitation of the Pentagon in '68, and I was also very interested in the Henry Flynn, who was on the fringe of Fluxus, organised action against cultural imperialism in New York in the 60s, and there was a famous speaker at the Judson Hall. So I combined those two things to do a demonstration against a Stockhausen concert as part of the May Festival in Brighton in '93, I think it was, where we levitated the Pavilion Theatre in Brighton to protest against Stockhausen. I mean, Flint had a whole critique of Stockhausen because he quoted him from the Times saying things like jazz is a beat and a few chords, barbaric, and all this kind of stuff. So there was a real reason for that critique of Stockhausen. But it's just interesting to kind of bring those things together and use them again. And then I was amazed no one had used a levitation for decades. And then all of a sudden, you know, the anarchists in London were levitating Parliament after we did Brighton Pavilion, and there was a levitation in the New Museum of Modern Art in Glasgow by some people calling themselves the Garber anarchists. So once people see that you can get media attention from this kind of thing.
But they said, with the acquittal of the Bristol statue toppers, the right-wing media, and I listened to LBC, which is pretty right-wing, and they said, oh, there'll be statues falling all over the country, they'll pull Churchill down in Parliament Square. But nothing's happened. So it didn't replicate itself.
No, but it doesn't need to replicate itself. It's better for a kind of slow process. I mean, obviously the big statue there's a struggle around at the moment is the Robert Jeffrey outside the Museum of the Home in Hoxton. I mean, you know, he was a Lord Mayor of London, part of the City of London Council establishment. And so that's a particular struggle, but there's other things going on. You know, they renamed Castle and Gardens in Hackney after I forget who they renamed it for now, but anyway, after a local black woman who I think was a teacher or something. And so those changes are happening slowly, and it's a slow process. I mean, some of the, you know, obviously the Cass statue was taken down from the Sir John Cass's Institute on Jury Street in the City of London. The Cass statue is still in the Guildhall, the City of London Council HQ, because they can't decide whether to obey the government or take it down, as they agreed to do.
Near me is the Christopher Columbus statue in Belgrave Square. And they covered it, I think they must have shot it with like chalk paint, red, and it looked amazing. They should have just left it.
No, well that's...
Now they've got a wooden box, so now there's a box, like a car montre, rather than removing the statue, you just can't see it.
Well, that's kind of like the Duke of Wellington, who
Yeah.
obviously was a Tory leader and committed colonial crimes in India, despite what all you talk about is kind of Waterloo and Napoleon at school. But he's boxed up outside the Royal Exchange in the City of London now, or he was. It was only till the end of January, but that was probably for repair. But the John Cass statue also had red paint put on.
But they look better. I prefer them like that in the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We're leaving out Prospero and Ariel outside BBC.
Oh, of course, yes, yes.
And it was interesting to watch the videos of that. They don't play this on the BBC. You can hear the crowds outside chanting to the tune of "Oh Jeremy Corbyn," "Oh Tommy Robinson." I don't know if anyone heard that. It was a kind of interesting.
Were they the supporters?
Yeah, they were
Supporting the guy
They
with
were
the
very
hand.
much. Yeah.
Well, also, you know, there's been attacks on Marx's grave and stuff like that, and threats of attacks after some of the statues as well.
Actually, you wrote a book about defacing art, didn't you? Vandalism. What's it called? Is that yours?
No, it's not. That's another one you read some other time. I mean, I did cover some of those kind of things in an early book called The Assault on Culture. It wasn't just about vandalism of art. But I mean, obviously that was something that interested the Situationists, for example, in particular, and defending people who went in and defaced art. And then there's the suffragettes, obviously. With the Venus de Rokeby, I mean, there's a whole history of kind of that kind of iconoclasm which you might want to take back to Protestant iconoclasm. But you know, there's suggestions are just shown to use the Mona Lisa as an ironing board, and there's a just a massive history of that kind of stuff, and also of similar interventions from the left and right. Just as you can take the statues, the lettrists who were connected to, but not necessarily precursor to the situations in international, depending on which faction you take. In 52, got up in Notre Dame Cathedral and announced that, with one of them dressed as a priest, announced that God is dead, which might have influenced the Father Christmas prank, who knows. But I think it's very slightly later, in the 50s anyway, there was a British fascist group called the League of Empire Loyalists, and they did something, got up in Westminster Cathedral and announced whatever it was that they wanted to announce. I'm not as close a follower of the right's use of these tactics as the left, but there are always parallels with the tactics. And obviously the kind of banner thing, the groups, BAN now, National Action, the Nazi group, obviously always doing their banner drops and that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's always parallels between the two things, but of course it depends what you're trying to say and why you're trying to say it.
Good thing we got Toby here then to explain what he was trying to say.
What were we trying to say back then? And that, we weren't particularly trying to say anything. It was a statement. We felt excluded from this sort of rarefied art establishment, which Cork Street really was the centre of the London art world. There wasn't satellite stuff going on. There wasn't an East London thing. So this represented the sort of bastion, and we attacked it. So it wasn't, that's about as articulate as it was, and we had our grievances, but it wasn't personal to anyone in particular. It was the street and what it represented, like a statue. And the paint didn't do any lasting damage. I wouldn't go, I don't really approve of vandalising art to make a statement. I don't mind adding to the art, like that Columbus statue with the red paint. It made it more interesting. And we made this street more interesting for like 36 hours or whatever. Some of you don't know, but the reason it became a big event with consequences of being arrested and stuff is we didn't know that MI5 occupied the top floors of the buildings that was no longer there. So I don't know what they thought, but maybe they thought we knew that and we were making a statement against them. So that's why it became a kind of, the repercussions for us were larger than just a prank.
No, I mean, it's interesting because the following year, 86, I was involved in a group show, Ruins of Glamour, at Chisenhale, actually in East London. And that was splattered with paint while the show was closed overnight, and the show was destroyed. It was mainly installation. And some cynics suggested that we did it ourselves because we got rather a lot of insurance money and for works we may or may not have sold, the value we'd priced them at. And the gallery were very happy because they got to redecorate the gallery, and we got a whole second wave of publicity after the initial reviews. But paint being thrown over artworks can have different effects. But of course I wouldn't throw paint over my own artwork to get the insurance money, as that would be criminal, and obviously I don't do that kind of thing.
What we're leaving out is that Toby didn't throw paint over an artwork, he threw paint over the gallery frontage, galleries, plural, frontage. And so, speaking as an art critic, I would say that beautiful, exquisite painterly handling, very sensitive splashes, drips, marks, all contained with the beautiful rectangle of the gallery windows. And we really take credit to the photographer, Andrew Catlin. Andrew did all those, didn't he?
Yeah, Andrew was here. So we did the action, the operation, and we had Andrew, who was like a music photographer, the enemy and that sort of thing. And then he instantly photographed it. He was also arrested, but they released him. But the reason there's us three on the panel is because we've all participated in these kind of actions. And I don't want to leave Neal out, and I don't know how much he wants to share about his own activity in this area, but I happen to know he's quite entirely innocent himself. I don't know if you want to elaborate on your.
Well,
It was very.
so many things I could confess, I don't know where to start. What were you referring to?
I'm referring to a gallery in your locale.
Yes. Yes.
And I think we would all agree with what Neal did. It's actually not really.
Neal's not saying what he did. So
Can I say what he did?
Well,
Thank you.
can we wait 37 years? Is that all right? And then we'll all meet here again, and then I'll talk about my
Action.
action. So make a note in your diary.
Okay, but everyone.
37. I'd like to return to the observation I was about to make, that we've got to reconcile instruction of art with instruction of art galleries. They need to be reconciled. What are we talking about the action as art? Because now it's like a Ed Ruscha series. It's a very beautiful series. 29. Well, it wasn't 29. How many was it? 15 trash art galleries.
Yeah.
They're very beautiful. And were you aware of the beauty at the time?
Well, it did look amazing. We did plan what we were going to do, but it was kind of chaotic. But it was like an action, so it's like, I don't know, Chris Burton or someone, and then the action's documented and that becomes the work. But really it was the action, and we weren't doing it as an art piece, we were doing it as a statement that we were artists, so maybe that's one and the same.
We can ask the audience at the end. We can have questions and answers, and they can answer that.
Where was the coverage? I remember it in the NME, but where else was the coverage?
Well, there was a D notice on the action, but there was some coverage in the Evening Standard, which is over there in the vitrines, and Artline, which is now defunct, and there was a graphic magazine, Art and Design. So there was
What we're leaving out is that in those days where we were all present, there wasn't social media, there weren't mobile phones. We all met, everybody met all the time, and word of mouth and actual gathering was critically important. We'd all be at gigs every single night, at clubs. I shouldn't have seemed to speak for you, Stewart, but people who were into punk and post-punk, to make a phone call, you had to go to a phone box, it often didn't work. And it was all about meeting people. And so Toby was a great hero in his community, in his village. And the punk, post-punk community was not huge, but it was a definite, you could be a hero in your own village in a way that you can't these days.
But that post-punk scene was very much more fragmented than the late 70s punk scene.
I'm being very London-centric, and I apologise.
No, I was born in South London, so I'm very London-centric as well, but I meant in London because it used to be in late 70s, you could go down the Marquee and you could go and see Adam and the Ants when they were a hardcore punk band one night, and you'd go and see Ultra Fox when they had John Fox, not Mitch, I hasten to add. The next night it would be the same audience, and you could go and see the UK subs, and it would be the same audience, more or less, so you'd see the same people. But once you got to the end of the 70s, it kind of split up into the kind of post-punk, more experimental stuff, and the anarcho-punk and the goth stuff.
If Toby was a punk band or a music band, and the Grey organisation did look like a band,
they would have been industrial and aligned to Psychic TV.
more New Order.
New
Because
Order.
we like the dance track.
Yeah, right.
Like you could actually listen to New Order as Test Department, you can't really.
Yeah.
Or Flybar. But so our world was Soho, and we lived in Bow, East London. So that meant we had relationships with this Hackney art scene around Genesis Peerage and Psychic TV. And but our world was pretty much Soho, and we would drink in the French House. This action, when the French House closed, we came and did Cork Street, and then we went to this bar called Zanzibar in Covent Garden, which was an early private members club, and then we went back to Bow and we got arrested the next day. But yeah, it was all centred around mainly Soho for us in like 85.
Yeah, no, a lot of it was
Yeah.
solo from 70s through, but
Yeah.
then there'd be other stuff kind of around other parts of London, because if you were going, you know, to say London Workers Group or something, as I used to in the late 70s, it would be on Farringdon Road and come on Farringdon Road and
Yeah.
all sorts of other,
And our films were shown at the London Filmmakers Co-op in
which was
Short
Camden,
Yeah.
yeah.
So there was this satellite stuff going on, and it was the beginning of the illegal warehouse parties, which we were throwing to finance our art making. So we were taking over buildings in East London and throwing warehouses and hospitals in King's Cross. But there was a scene, it was all fueled with flyers. That's how people came together. There was a lot of young people with not much to do. So there was a thriving audience. And they all felt excluded from the sort of establishment. If Cork Street was the art establishment, we felt excluded. So that's what you do, right? You go for the top.
Years ago, I used to promote bands in the early 80s, and I used to have to get the name of the band into Time Out before a certain time in the week, and I very often didn't know what band was going to be on. So I'd make up the names of bands, just so there'd be something in Time Out. So when I put the Vandalmatics in Time Out, lo and behold, 50, 60 skinheads turned up. When I put the Hippies from Heaven, a load of hippies turned up. What are we saying about the identity you had, the look you had, because 37 years later, it's really different. Our understanding of what you were doing has changed, hasn't it?
Right. Well, our look, there was 4 of us, and our look was uniform, so we wore grey suits from charity shops, white shirts with no tie, because we had no allegiance, and cropped hair. But we weren't skinheads, but we looked like skinheads, especially if you didn't know what a skinhead was. And our idea was this kind of reflecting Soviet monoculture with capitalist and yuppie culture. And that was our identity, and our idea was to make art as a unit. We weren't into... What was happening in America is you had Julian Schnabel and heroic artist figures, quite old-fashioned, we thought. We wanted to make art like a band, and like a band makes music. So all our art was made as this, we weren't a cooperative for it, but we were a collective, I guess.
You all lived together, didn't you?
We lived together in Bow in these short life housing, which was available then. We had 2 terraced houses, and we had a studio in Borough, on Borough High Street. This is all without working, with no income. You could do it then. And so we had this uniformity idea, and we created art, like you can see on the walls, like our handprints or diaristic stuff reflecting our daily lives and drawing around each other. That was the kind of idea of what we made, and then this action was another reflection of our ideology, like an attack. We weren't passive.
No, I mean, to give a kind of parallel, at the time apparently slightly more successful art group in Compete Mott, because there were originally 3 people and then became 2. I mean, Art in Ruins, so they must have signed to Gimple Feast around 85, who were in Davies Street. And again, they were very into grey and did all this black and white work. They were trained as architects, the 2 people who made up the group after the 3rd founder left very early on. So doing these big kind of black and white installations, but using kind of postmodern theory, Baudrillard and whatever. And a lot of people thought they were going to be the next big thing before the YBA came along, and they weren't. But they're still around.
We were adopted early on by Gilbert and George. We featured in their work, and also Derek Jarman. So those were relationships we had with more.
What about the stylistic relationship with Gilbert and George? I think when I read the manifesto style writing that the Grey organisation put out, I think of Gilbert and George's writing, which is a whole aspect of them in its own, a very significant aspect of Gilbert and George, separate from the art almost. And I think of your writing as having elements of that. And I'm not quite sure how much of your statements, I should have, it's in the excellent publication. It's a bit like the IRA putting out a statement. and it's slightly disproportionate to the actuality. But how much was it a satire or a parody or a
Well, we
mockery?
used to like the Angry Brigade, who were this anarchist, I wouldn't like to say terrorist group, but they did plant a few bombs. But they would do these communiques like Bader Meinhof, and we co-opted that idea, not as a parody, just as a way to communicate. And then with Gilbert and George, they had all this drinking sculptures and putting their life into their art. We took from that. We used to say they were our parents. Now you could say that, but back then.
I mean, there's a lot to explore, like Gilbert and George, confessional art. Where are you situated in confessional art? The work here, there are some aspects of it. That's your rubbish, presumably, not someone else's rubbish.
Right.
Your
lager
cans.
Yeah. We wanted to put ourselves into it, or make the art like actually be us. So that's why it's a handprint, or we drew around. Quite simple, really.
One of the subjects I'd like to talk about is masculinity, but I'm not quite sure where I would end up talking about masculinity. But the beer cans, correct me if I'm wrong, it's confessional art, it's inventory art, it's also the unblemished can is erect, enjoying some virility, and the other one is not erect and is exhausted. And it's a bit like a kind of feminist artwork, but from a young urban males.
Well, because we worked with Derek Jarman, who really revelled in that kind of the homoerotic thing that he saw in us, we were aware that we reflected that hyper-masculinity of the skinhead thing. But we weren't really dwelling on it, but we were aware of it.
But it's there everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, punk was very masculine, really, wasn't it? Obviously we had the fantastic female punk bands, but they were struggling to break new ground. Fundamentally, correct me if you think I'm wrong, it was very masculine, black clothes and boots.
I think it depends which bands you take. I mean, obviously, the female bands like the Slits, all later on the Raincoats, polystyrene with X-ray specs, but yeah, I think the Clash were very kind of heterosexist and posturing in a really boring way.
Yeah.
But
Adam Mant, he was a great London punk band. He was hyper-masculine, but he was...
Well, he was using all the BDSM with the dominance and submission, and also, he was in Jubilee, Jarman's film Jubilee, and I think there's, beat me with a truncheon or a cricket bat, beat me, it could be really where it's at or whatever, which was all the stuff they were singing when I was going to see them in the 70s. Yeah, I don't think that is, I mean, okay, it might be classically male masochistic, but it's not the same kind of posturing as you got from Joe Strummer and Mick Jones. It was quite different. I was also curious, though, to move it back to the Jarman circle, if you came across, which I certainly did at that time, people like John Mabry who were part of the Jarman circle.
Yeah, because I lived on Carburton Street with Boy George and Marilyn. So this is just prior to the formation of the Grey Organisation. I lived in these notorious squats with around that kind of blitz and new romantics. So I lived in that kind of weird gender bending era before we decamped to Bow. So yeah, Carriff lived on Warren Street, and I lived with Boy George and Marilyn, and a band called Animal Nightlife. But I actually didn't really identify with that so much. I mean, I went to Blitz, and that was a post-punk kind of dressing up glam thing.
Yeah.
But I was actually listening more to New Order.
But you were looking like a cross between a very fashion-conscious gay, a heroin addict, and
well, thank you, man.
concentration camp.
Yeah. But I'm not sure how much awareness we had about all that. It was the time.
AIDS as well.
Well, it was before AIDS.
Well, was it?
Yeah. Well, because Grey Organisation formed in like 83, 3, 4. Yeah.
Until
AIDS really got going when he started dying.
what year was that?
86,
Were you
88.
still around then?
Yeah, I was in New York then. But
So what are we saying about masculinity? Were you subverting masculinity? Were you?
no, we weren't that. We were quite like rampantly heterosexual, all of us. We weren't. Yeah. Those issues weren't really playing out like they do today.
Yeah, but in retrospect, 37 years later, when we look at the photographs, we can take it perhaps can reconsider.
Yeah. Yeah, we were aware of that whole, because there was another skinhead revival centred in King's Cross in this, is it the Bell?
You mean all
the
oh,
gays.
skin.
No,
Oh, the
the
gay
gays
skinhead,
skinheads,
yeah.
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 So that was happening, where a skinhead was no longer this threatening character. He was more likely to be this weird kind of offshoot of gay culture, which had, they have all these archetypes like leather men, or then it became the skinhead, and so people would actually incorporate us with that, but we weren't part of that. So yeah, those things were happening, and obviously Boy George had started it in the sort of mainstream. I mean, that was a big deal at the time, Boy George. It really was. He really tipped everything upside down.
Can I, me being the interviewer here, was not really supposed to happen. There's Harriet Viner wrote in what was then the Cork Street magazine, I think it was called Catalogue. She was talking about Robert Fraser. Robert Fraser was a very notable UK art dealer, very important, and his was one of the galleries that received the attention of Toby's paint, and Robert Fraser was quoted by Harriet Viner, who said that here's Robert Fraser's radicalism didn't satisfy everyone. In May 1985, the Grey organisation, deciding that Cork Street represented all that was stale in art, threw paint over the windows of the Robert Fraser Gallery, among others. Robert was ill by then. Robert Fraser was dying of AIDS, so it was a thing then. But he, Robert Fraser, was fairly dismissive of this action. He would have been stimulated by a more imaginative protest, even if that had been still more inconvenient to put right. So, was Robert Fraser genuine, or was that a kind of huffy art world response? The traditional art world response to insult is to ignore it. The art world does that like no other human institution. They can blank something if they don't like it. What do you think about that reaction? Do you think that you could have done a more imaginative protest? Were you happy with that protest?
No, I'm very pleased with our process. It was very blunt in your face, and it wasn't, it is what it is. Maybe you could do something more like, I don't know. There's this thing where people place their art in galleries and museums, like Banksy did it, but lots of people have done it for years, right? Discreetly placing bits of art or switching art. There's all that sort of thing, but that's a bit too subtle. We didn't want to be subtle. We wanted to shout.
Yeah, but it's subtle because they are images of great beauty.
Yeah, but if you walk down the street after the attack, it looked like a Richard Serra or something. Bang. Couldn't be missed.
But Fraser's such a figure of the 60s as well.
Right.
Robert Fraser is such a figure of the 60s, you know what I mean? He was kind of well out of his time
Yes.
by then. Although, that's not to deny his importance in the 60s, but but maybe he lacked the imagination to see the subtlety in the attack. Maybe it's as much about the reception of the viewer as it is about the action.
Yeah. It's taken 37 years to get to this point, hasn't it?
It's been a long time coming.
Does the criminal always return to the scene of the crime?
In this case, yes.
I regard it a bit like salmon spawning. Taken 37 years for the salmon to swim upstream to where it to its breeding ground. It's it's quite a noble, natural event.
Were you thinking of Metzger's acid paintings when you did it? Because obviously the grey paint on the glass has...
No, we knew about those auto-destruct sculptures. Is it Tingley?
Well, they Tingley did them, yeah.
Yeah.
Metzger suggested various ones, including the really interesting one at the Oakland Castle roundabout. But
No, Metzger was, I know about him now, but then he wasn't as known as the Tingley sculpture. So he created a sculpture that destroyed itself at MoMA in New York around 65, maybe, I don't know. But those ideas we found very attractive.
How did he do that? How did it destroy itself?
I don't know,
it was
like,
programmed to destroy
yeah,
itself, bits to
it was a
attract,
kinetic
yeah.
sculpture that destroyed itself.
The screws got loose.
But yeah, so that appealed to us.
So let's see what the time is. It's formally time for, with excellent timing, the audience started asking questions. Are you happy with that?
Yeah. So if there's any questions, thank you very much, by the way, for your brilliant.
In a theoretical world, if at the end of 1985 the Mayor Gallery had come, asked you to put on this show, then, and you talk a lot about being excluded,
Right.
would you have said yes?
Yeah, we would have said yes. That. We were actually going to New York. We showed the civilian warfare in the East Village, which was this exciting new art scene. We didn't actually identify with the galleries on this street. The only gallery we ever met with was the Listen Gallery, who were over in Paddington. So no, we never had any idea that we would ever show on this street. It was always a bit old hat. So the galleries that interested us at the time and the way would be Anthony Doffey and the Listen Gallery.
Were you connecting with John Latham, who was at the Listen?
No, he just, the only, Nicholas Logsdale came to our studio. The other person who came to our studio is, what's his name, from the Royal Academy? Norman Rosenthal. So we weren't totally ignored, but no one gave us a show apart from Pete Lewis, here in the front row, gave the Grey Organisation an exhibition in 1985, Submarine Gallery, King's Cross. So we did have some exposure. And then one of our actions, which we did twice, was we gate crashed the London Contemporary Art Fair, which was held in Olympia. It was all a big new thing. And as everyone's setting up, and as you know if you do any exhibitions, it's just chaos. We just marched in with our paintings, and then we worked out where some vacant walls were and just put them up. We did that twice. So, yeah. But
Any more?
Toby, interested in the MI5, just because these three collectors. So, is there any more information you can tell us about what happened after you got arrested? Were you incarcerated for years, shackled to a chair and tortured? So what actually happened?
Yeah.
we were arrested and we lived in Bruce Road, Bow. We were arrested by Special Branch and taken to the police station on Savile Road called West End Central. And we were questioned and fingerprinted and all that stuff. And the detective in charge told me that we upset some very important people. And anyway, we were charged and we appeared at Wells Street Magistrate Court, which is by Oxford Circus. None of these institutions exist now. They're either wine bars or blocks of flats. And then on the third hearing at the Magistrates Court, we had very prestigious solicitors called Offenbarts who represented us. And then we went and our case, we had a court date and everything, papers, and the case had disappeared there was no case. There was no case number. And our lawyer said, this has never happened, we've never seen this. And they said, you can go, there's no case. So we weren't even acquitted or anything, it just evaporated. So that was good.
What happened to you? Because that's quite a big thing, engaging with the wonderful MI5s. I mean,
No, we didn't engage with them. We engaged with the police.
okay, all right. You engaged with the police and you went on and got married. So,
Especially.
but what happened to your life after that?
Well, we were then, okay, so one of the stipulations when we were arrested was we couldn't enter central London. So we were banned from central London. But we had this this dialogue was going on with New York. So pretty much as soon as it was over, we decamped to New York. And you could, in those days, just move. It was, pretty fluid. And so the whole Grey organisation just moved to the East Village and stayed there till 92, till we disbanded. But the consequences after the action was every time we were in the West End, we would be stopped and searched by the police, every time, without fail. So I get kind of subtle harassment.
Vanessa, you got a question?
I think I got the answer now, because I was curious about that too. But I mean, when you actually did the physical running, you were 4 guys with buckets of grey paint, you had to do every single gallery, all the windows.
Okay, so
in a rush.
we had a transit van in the middle of this street,
Yeah.
and the doors opened at the bottom there by Burlington Arcade.
Yeah.
And we had all our tins of paint lined up, and the paint was watered down. And there wasn't just the 4 of us, we had about another 6 to help out. And it was like a military operation.
Quick.
And we did it maybe in 30 seconds, the whole street. We had 2 teams, one for each side of the street.
And did you go back into the van and,
Yeah.
and drove off?
So the van moved at like 5 miles an hour down the street, and we replenished. I remember there were more art galleries on the street then. Every shop was an art gallery.
And did you see any galleries, dealers coming out?
No, because there was midnight. But James was still around, because there it is.
Yeah.
There's James. This is like maybe 15 minutes after we'd done it. And I think they had an opening, so he was still around.
We shouldn't just say 4 guys, we should honour the other Grey organisation members by name, shall we?
Yep.
Dan Saccio, Paul Spencer and the late Tim Burke. We should make sure that they're acknowledged properly in this conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk, it was really interesting. I was wondering if you could tell me about how did you have a warmer reception in New York? Did you find the East Village art scene was more, you had more success and it was easier to find like artistic careers there? And what was it like? What was the experience at the time?
Yeah, it was definitely, because America, they consume stuff. That's what they do, whatever it is. So even though it was this renegade art scene in the East Village, there was the Soho art scene for the bigger artists, but there was this burgeoning scene. And we were warmly received. And then we got involved in hip hop and different commercial activity to make money. Lived in Soho. America's a dynamic place, even now.
When you have the big institutional show that you deserve, that's not quite really what people are going to be talking about. They'll be talking about the art, won't they? I don't feel quite. I've heard enough about you describing the art. And people think there is not much art. There's a huge amount of art that they make.
There's a lot of art, and there's a small selection on the wall over there, which we just tried to pick out pieces from London era and the New York era. We showed a lot in San Francisco, showed there twice. Well, the art is, we touched on it earlier, it's this diaristic stuff, and then there was this hip-hop stuff with De La Soul and Public Enemy and bands like that. It was a very, there's no computers, so it's not that sophisticated, like in the realms of graphics. It's pretty simple. Like if you look at those flowers, we drew those flowers. They're on that album cover, which is iconic, 3 feet high and rising. It's just drawn on acetate with Posca paint pens. Posca paint pens are a new thing. So it's like liquid paint. It's not like a marker. And then next to it is the content of our rubbish bin. And then next to that, above James, is a canvas that was stretched on our studio floor that we walked on for a few months. Not intentionally walked on, it was just there. And then it became an artwork. Next to that is a Heineken beer label, so that's a bottle of beer. Take the label off, it's varnished with the hair. We used to save all the hair from shaving our heads. And we used to cover everything in that, and that's kind of making it, putting ourselves into it. And we called those pieces memos. And there's hundreds of memos, with, from beer bottles to drug wrappers to whatever we consumed. And then oddly, we worked for this PR guru, Lynn Franks, who Absolutely Fabulous is based on. And she got us involved in various projects, like the launch of Swatch Watch, Brutus Jeans with Samantha Fox, the pastry girl. And one of the things was Neil Kinnock's campaign, election campaign, and there was something called Red Wedge, which was aimed at, the younger voting sort of audience. So we did these T-shirts that now shout Labour.
Are you deliberately referencing David Robiliard?
No, but he was a friend of ours, because David we worked with Gilbert and Joy. So, and then next to that is we did this superhero series, but rather than having the ancient heroes, Greek legends and stuff, we chose modern ones like Rocky and Luke Skywalker and stuff. And then the next piece is more beer. A lot of beer was consumed, and that's New York has its own beer called Rolling Rock, and that's a Rolling Rock bottle or two, crushed up and covered and varnished with our hair again. So that's the kind of taste. And then in the office is a big painting, 3 meters by 3 meters, called Death, with us descending into hell. It's in the catalogue if you have a look. And it's pretty, so we did we did some large scale stuff as well.
Any more questions?
Yeah, last one.
Can we just go ahead first? We'll come back to you.
So looking back, the person that you were in 85, has it been worth it to become part of the establishment?
If only I was.
I think it suggests that you are.
Yeah, it's a journey. So yeah, you can't keep fighting the machine.
But you're still in a position of a commentator. You're publishing Empire, which is a fantastic, really impressive publishing series of books about skinheads or punk.
Yes.
You're situated in the role of a commentator.
Yeah, I explore different subcultures in my publishing, and I also have a fair called Cultural Traffic, which is for young zine makers. So that's like a platform for people who are a bit like me, So we try to have something for them to show their stuff and travel around. And then with the publishing, we highlight, like my next book's about rave culture, so this kind of stuff that isn't really looked at or presented in spaces like this.
Vanessa, was that you again?
The young people now who are struggling to even study art, they can't maybe not even do it. What do you think? What can you say to them? What can they do to make their art now?
Well, I think in a way, to me it looks like they're more fortunate because they have other avenues and platforms. But they're always telling me how much better it was in my day when, before mobile phones or social media. So, I don't know, but in a way, if you're stuck in some isolated community and you're online, you can communicate with the whole world. Whereas when I was young, you had to go to a city. But they did. They all managed to go to whichever the capital was.
Yeah.
Now you don't need to. You can probably make some kind of impact online, but there's a lot of voices. So.
But now you can't afford to either if you're young. You know, that's a problem, because that's what amazes me. People come to go to art school in London and they're living in Croydon or somewhere, and you think, well, is Croydon London? I'm not sure. I'm scratching my head.
Yeah.
Okay, the last question, go please.
Can I ask about, hi Toby, Stewart, Neal, great chat, thank you. Can I ask about the D-Light and how all of that all happened?
De La Soul.
De La Soul, God, I'm too, yeah, sorry, yeah.
I can
How did
tell
all
you.
of that happen? Like, was it that you knew each other? Was
No,
it,
well, it's all that sort of synchronicity. So MTV came to London, and they did a story about London, and the Grey organisation featured in this clip, whatever. And then, fast forward a couple of years in New York, we're walking down the street, and the guy who made that promo, because remember, everyone's in a city, right? Like we're talking about the internet. So in America, you're in New York, mainly, and in the UK, you're in London. And then Mark Pellington, he goes, hey guys, remember me, blah, blah, blah. And then he came to our show, and then he said, I'm making this video for a band called Information Society, who were this dance band from Minneapolis. And they were on Tommy Boy Records. Anyway, we made this music video, and it was popular, as in it was on repeat play on MTV. MTV was new. And then Monica Lynch, who ran Tommy Boy Records, said, oh, we just signed this new act. And they gave us this record, Plug Tuning by De La Soul. No one knew. At the time, hip-hop was really kind of Run DMC, Public Enemy, very aggressive, very macho.
yeah, it was the first Sunshine.
Yeah, and like gold chains and guns and stuff. And De La Soul rejected all that, so probably they never thought this was going anywhere. But anyway, we did this Daisy Age thing, and it just blew up, but there's no telling what's going to be successful when you do a project, you know. Like we had no idea, it's just another project. Now it's top 10 album covers of all time.
So were you working sort of as a commercial entity in some way in New York? Was that
Yeah, but I
kind
mean,
of part
that's,
of it?
we were working, we weren't.
Yeah. Like, yeah.
We weren't incorporated. We just got jobs.
Mm.
That was the job that fell in our lap. And
Yeah,
I could name all the other hip hop acts that no one's ever heard of because they didn't make it.
sure.
But that was the one that did.
Thank you, Kirsty.
Thank you very much. Before we say goodbye to the show, I just want you to know there's a catalogue that's available for sale. There's little tins of paint you might want to utilise on your way home. So thank you very much, guys.